before anything else, I need to be honest with you. This is not a typical video, and this is not a subject I take lightly. For a long time, I hesitated to talk about this publicly, because there are certain topics that, once truly understood, change the way you see everything, not just the world around you, but yourself, your decisions, your fears, your certainties. Everything begins to be questioned. When we talk about the 9 dimensions of consciousness, many people imagine something distant, abstract, almost fantastical, something that would have no real impact on everyday life. I used to think the same way. I believed it was just another interesting concept, just another theory among many. But the deeper I went, the more I realized this wasn't just knowledge, it was a process. And processes have side effects. What I'm going to share here doesn't come only from books or isolated theories. It comes from connections between studies, accounts, and human experiences repeated throughout time. Different people, different cultures, different eras, all describing the same patterns, the same inner transitions, the same risks. And that's why I need to make one thing clear from the very beginning. This is not for everyone. There is an invisible line between healthy curiosity and going too far. And the problem is that no one tells you exactly where that line is. Each person discovers it on their own, sometimes too late. As consciousness expands, something strange happens. You don't just gain answers, you gain questions that can no longer be ignored. And some of those questions are uncomfortable. They challenge your identity, the way you fit into the world, and your sense of belonging. Some people call this awakening, others call it a crisis, and some call it a mistake. What I do know is this: there are real consequences. They don't appear immediately. They're not dramatic like in the movies. They're silent, subtle, cumulative. And when you finally notice them, you're already different. Thinking differently, feeling differently, living differently. So if you decide to keep watching, do it with attention, not as pure entertainment, but as someone willing to reflect. I'm not here to convince you of anything, only to show you a map, knowing that maps don't force anyone to walk. The 9 dimensions of consciousness are not a glorious destination. They are a complex territory. And like any unknown territory, they require caution. When people hear the phrase dimensions of consciousness, most of them immediately imagine something mystical, vague, or disconnected from reality. I used to think the same way. It sounded like a metaphor at best, or spiritual exaggeration at worst. But the deeper I went, the more I realized that this concept is not about fantasy at all. It's about how reality is perceived, not where it exists. These dimensions are not physical places you can travel to. You don't enter them with your body. You enter them with your perception. Each dimension represents a different way the mind organizes information, identity, time, and meaning. In simple terms, it's not about where you are. It's about how to interpret everything. At the lowest levels, consciousness is reactive. You respond to stimuli. You feel hunger, fear, pleasure, pain. There's no distance between you and the experience. As consciousness evolves, something subtle happens. You begin to observe yourself. Thoughts are no longer absolute truths. Emotions are no longer the only compass. You start to notice patterns. That's the key word, patterns. Each higher dimension of consciousness reveals patterns that were invisible before. Patterns in your behavior, patterns in society, patterns in how fear, control, belief, and identity operate. And once you see a pattern clearly, you can't unsee it. That's where the process becomes irreversible. This is why dimensions of consciousness are often misunderstood. People think they are about gaining power, enlightenment, or special abilities. But in reality, they are about losing illusions. And losing illusions is rarely comfortable. As I studied this, I noticed something unsettling. Every major framework, psychological, philosophical, spiritual, even neurological, points to the same idea. Human awareness is layered and moving. Between layers changes the rules of how reality feels. What once felt solid becomes flexible. What once felt meaningful starts to dissolve. And what once felt impossible suddenly feels obvious. But here's the part no one talks about enough. Higher awareness does not automatically mean peace. Sometimes it means conflict. Sometimes it means confusion. Sometimes it means standing in a space where old answers no longer work, but new ones haven't formed yet. That's why calling these stages dimensions actually makes sense. Each one has its own internal logic, its own assumptions, its own emotional gravity. Trying to live in one dimension while thinking from another creates friction. And that friction is where many people struggle. Understanding the dimensions of consciousness isn't about labeling yourself as advanced or awake. It's about recognizing where you are, how you see the world, and what that perspective costs you. Because every shift in awareness gives something and takes something away at some point. I began to notice something that I couldn't ignore anymore. No matter where I looked, different philosophies, psychological models, spiritual traditions, even modern theories of consciousness, the same idea kept resurfacing. Not always with the same language, not always with the same structure, but with the same limit, the same upper boundary. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence. The human mind is very good at finding patterns where none exist, but the repetition was too consistent, too widespread, and too meaningful to simply ignore. Cultures that never interacted with one another still described awareness as unfolding in a limited number of stages, and strangely, many of them converged. Around 9. What made this unsettling wasn't the number itself, it was what the number represented. In many systems, 9 is not portrayed as a place of comfort or completion, but as a threshold, a point where expansion slows down, where the structure of identity becomes unstable, where the mind can no longer rely on the same reference points it used before. It's often described as the last level the human psyche can integrate without losing coherence. That idea stayed with me. As I looked deeper, I realized that the first few dimensions are about survival and structure. Who am I? What do I feel? What do I believe? How do I fit into the world? These questions dominate most of our lives. But as awareness grows, the questions shift. They become less personal and more existential. Less about me and more about the system itself. By the time consciousness approaches what many call the 9th dimension, something profound happens. The observer begins to observe the act of observing. Identity becomes fluid. Time feels less linear. Cause and effect start to blur, not in a mystical sense, but in a psychological one. You begin to see how meaning itself is constructed, and this is where things become dangerous for some people, because the structures that once held the mind together, beliefs, goals, social roles, start to lose their authority. And if those structures dissolve faster than new ones can form, the result is not enlightenment, it's fragmentation. That's why the number 9 appears so often as a warning, not a prize. Some traditions stop there intentionally, others speak of higher dimensions, but always with caution, always emphasizing guidance, discipline, and integration. The message is subtle, but consistent. There is a point beyond which exploration becomes destabilizing if the foundation is weak. The more I understood this, the clearer it became that the number 9 isn't arbitrary. It represents the edge of what the human mind can hold while still functioning in everyday reality. Beyond it, the risk isn't ignorance, it's disconnection. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Just because something can be explored, does that mean it should be? Before anything becomes dangerous, before consciousness feels unstable or overwhelming, there is a phase that almost everyone passes through without even realizing it. The first dimensions of consciousness are not hidden. They are not secret. In fact, they are so familiar that most people mistake them for reality itself. This is where consciousness begins, raw experience. At these early levels, awareness is tightly fused with sensation, emotion, and immediate thought. You feel something, you react. You think something, you believe it. There's very little distance between what happens inside you and how to interpret the world. Life feels solid, direct, and unquestionable. This is the dimension of survival, identity, and social conditioning. You learn who you are by contrast. You are this, not that. You belong here, not there. Your beliefs are inherited before they are examined. Your fears are absorbed before they are understood. And for most of human history, this level of consciousness was not only enough, it was necessary. As awareness expands slightly, something subtle changes. You begin to notice your own thoughts. Not control them yet, just notice them. You start to realize that emotions come and go, that beliefs were learned, that reactions are not always choices. This is still a safe zone, a functional zone. Society is built for people who live here, but even at this stage, the seeds of discomfort are planted, because once you notice that a thought is just a thought, it loses some of its authority. Once you realize that an emotion can be observed, it stops fully controlling you, and once that happens, you can never return to complete unconsciousness. This is why the early dimensions are deceptively important. They create the foundation. If that foundation is stable, curiosity grows naturally and safely. If it isn't, the desire to escape discomfort can push someone forward too fast. I've seen people mistake dissatisfaction with awakening. They feel lost, disconnected, or frustrated with life, and they assume the solution is to go higher, to access deeper states of awareness. But that's not how this works. Skipping integration doesn't lead to clarity, it leads to confusion. The early dimensions are where meaning is built, where values are formed, where the ego, for all its flaws, provides structure. Trying to dissolve that structure before understanding it is like removing the frame of a building before the walls can stand on their own. And this is where many people unknowingly make their first mistake. They underestimate the importance of the familiar stages. They see them as primitive or limiting. But without mastering these levels, without understanding emotion, identity, responsibility, and grounded perception, the higher dimensions don't feel expansive. They feel destabilizing. The truth is, everyone has already been moving through dimensions of consciousness their entire life. The difference is that most people do it slowly, naturally, and unconsciously. Problems arise when the process becomes forced, accelerated, or romanticized. There is a moment in this process that feels fundamentally different from everything that comes before it. I didn't recognize it immediately when I reached it, but looking back, I can say with certainty that this was the point where curiosity turned into consequence. This is what I now think of as the breaking point of consciousness. Up until this stage, expansion feels gradual, manageable. You learn something new about yourself, adjust, and move on. But here, the shift is not incremental, it's structural. The way your mind organizes reality begins to change faster than your sense of identity can keep up with. For me, it started subtly. Familiar ideas began to feel hollow. Goals that once motivated me lost their emotional weight. Even language felt insufficient at times, as if words were approximations of something deeper that I couldn't quite articulate. At first, this felt liberating, like stepping outside a narrow room into a larger space. But then came the instability. Time no longer felt consistent. Days passed quickly, then slowly. Cause and effect felt distorted, not in the external world, but internally. Actions didn't produce the same emotional feedback they used to. Things that once felt meaningful became neutral, and things that once felt neutral suddenly felt heavy. What I realized later is that this stage forces a separation between awareness and identity. You don't just observe thoughts, you observe the observer. And when that happens, the sense of I becomes fluid, unreliable, difficult to anchor. This is where many people experience fear, not dramatic fear, not panic, but a quiet, creeping unease, a sense that the ground beneath your psychological feet is shifting. You can still function, you can still talk, work, socialize, but internally, something feels unresolved, like a question that won't stop asking itself. And here's the dangerous part. If you don't understand what's happening, you might assume something is wrong with you. Some people label this stage as awakening, others call it dissociation, some mistake it for enlightenment, others for mental illness. The truth is more uncomfortable. It's a transition, and transitions are inherently unstable. At this point, the mind desperately wants certainty. It wants a framework, a story, something to hold on to. And this is where belief systems, ideologies, and extreme interpretations can become attractive. They offer structure at a time when structure feels like it's dissolving. I've seen people cling to spiritual identities here. Others cling to nihilism. Some retreat back into old patterns out of fear, and some push forward aggressively, convinced that the discomfort means they're close to something extraordinary. But this stage is not a test of courage, it's a test of integration. If awareness expands faster than emotional and psychological grounding, the result isn't clarity, it's fragmentation. The mind begins to split experience instead of unify it. And that's where real damage can occur. This is the point where the journey stops being abstract, because from here on, the consequences are no longer theoretical. This is the part where most explanations stop, not because it's unimportant, but because it's uncomfortable. When people talk about higher states of consciousness, they usually focus on insight, freedom, clarity, or awakening. What almost no one prepares you for are the real-world consequences that come with seeing too much, too clearly, too fast. One of the first changes I noticed was a growing sense of distance, not from reality itself, but from the way reality is usually experienced. Conversations began to feel repetitive. Social roles started to feel artificial. I could still participate, still function, still play my part, but internally, Something had shifted. It felt like standing slightly out of sync with the world. Another consequence was emotional flattening, not numbness, exactly, but a reduction. In intensity, things that once triggered strong reactions no longer did. This can sound peaceful on the surface, but it comes with a cost. Motivation weakens, attachment loosens, and without careful grounding, life can start to feel strangely hollow. There's also isolation, not always physical, but psychological. When your internal framework changes, it becomes harder to explain your perspective without sounding detached, arrogant, or unstable. So you stop explaining. You keep things to yourself. Over time, this silence creates a gap between you and others. And then there's the hardest consequence to accept. You don't get to choose what stays meaningful. As consciousness expands, certain illusions collapse. Some of them were comforting. Some were necessary. Beliefs about success, identity, purpose, they don't disappear all at once, but they lose their emotional authority. You see how they were constructed. And once you see the mechanism, belief no longer works the same way. This is where many people panic, because society is built on shared assumptions. When those assumptions weaken internally, you can still operate, but it takes effort. You begin to feel like a visitor inside systems you once belonged to naturally. None of this means that expanding consciousness is bad, but it does mean it's not neutral. Every expansion removes something along with what it adds. And if you're not prepared for that loss, if you expect only gain, the experience can feel like something has gone wrong. Nothing has gone wrong. You're just seeing the price. At some point, I began encountering stories that sounded disturbingly similar. Different people, different backgrounds, same conclusion. I wish I had slowed down. I didn't know it would cost this much. I can't go back. Regret doesn't come from understanding more. It comes from understanding the fast, without integration. Some people push forward out of curiosity, others out of pain. They want answers, relief, escape, and when the mind opens rapidly, it delivers. But without regard for timing, insights arrive before the nervous system is ready. Perspectives shift before identity can adapt. That's when regret begins. Not dramatic regret, quiet regret, the kind that shows up in small moments. Difficulty enjoying simple things, a sense of disconnection from ambition, trouble relating to people who are still anchored in frameworks that no longer feel real to you. I've heard people say, I feel like I broke something in myself. What they broke wasn't their mind. They broke the illusion of return. Once certain layers of perception are peeled back, you can't simply choose to believe again. You can't unknow what you now see, and while that can be freeing, it can also be destabilizing if you weren't ready to carry it. Another source of regret comes from identity loss. When old labels fall away, profession, belief system, role, narrative, what's left can feel empty at first. An emptiness without guidance feels like failure. Some people mistake this stage for being above others. Others mistake it for being broken. Both interpretations miss the point. This phase isn't about superiority or deficiency. It's about reconstruction. The regret appears when someone tries to live as if nothing has changed, but something has. Consciousness doesn't expand in a straight line. It expands by dissolving structures and forcing new ones to emerge. If you resist that rebuilding process, if you try to hold on to the old life without adapting, the tension becomes unbearable. That's why some people warn others away from this path. Not out of fear, out of honesty. Because once you cross certain thresholds, the question is no longer what will I gain? It becomes what am I willing to lose? And that's not a question everyone is ready to answer on. Of the most dangerous mistakes I see people make is turning consciousness expansion into a fantasy. A story where awakening is portrayed as pure light, constant peace, and effortless clarity. Where every shift upward is framed as progress, and every discomfort is dismissed as part of the process. This romanticization is not harmless. When awakening is idealized, suffering gets misunderstood, confusion is reframed as enlightenment, instability is mistaken for transcendence, and warning signs are ignored because they don't fit the narrative people want to believe. I've watched people push themselves far beyond what they were ready to handle, convinced that pain meant progress, that fear meant transformation, that losing their sense of grounding was a necessary sacrifice. But growth doesn't require self-destruct, and awareness doesn't demand collapse. The problem is that romantic narratives remove responsibility from the process. They suggest that if something feels overwhelming, the solution is to go further, not slower. that if reality feels disconnected? The answer is more expansion, not integration. This mindset creates a feedback loop where the mind keeps dissolving structures without rebuilding anything in their place, and without structure, awareness doesn't feel free, it feels chaotic. Another danger is comparison. When awakening is turned into an identity, people begin measuring themselves against others. Who is more aware? Who has gone further? Who sees more? This subtle competition pulls the process away from understanding and into ego reinforcement. Even as the ego claims it's dissolving, true expansion doesn't need an audience. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform. It integrates quietly into how you live, how you relate, how you act. When consciousness becomes something to display rather than something to embody, it loses its grounding. Romanticizing awakening also ignores the nervous system. The body is not separate from awareness. If perception changes faster than the body can adapt, stress accumulates, anxiety increases, sleep suffers, emotional regulation weakens. These are not signs of transcendence. They are signs of overload. Awareness without stability doesn't liberate. It destabilizes. That's why I believe the most dangerous lie is the idea that awakening is always positive, always upward, always desirable. Sometimes the wisest move isn't to open further, it's to pause, to ground, to integrate what's already been seen, because consciousness doesn't just expand outward, it must also settle inward, and when that balance is ignored, awakening stops being insight and becomes escape, reaching what many frameworks describe as the ninth dimension of consciousness is not what most people expect. It doesn't arrive with fireworks, it doesn't feel like victory, and it certainly doesn't feel like completion. If anything, it feels like weight. At this level, awareness becomes deeply systemic. You don't just see individual patterns. You see how patterns generate other patterns, how beliefs create behavior, how behavior reinforces systems, how systems shape identity. The separation between internal and external reality becomes thin. You begin to understand not just what happens, but why it had to happen that way. And that understanding carries responsibility. At this stage, meaning no longer comes from personal narratives alone. Success, failure, praise, criticism, they all feel smaller, less absolute. This can bring peace, but it can also bring disorientation. Because when the old motivations dissolve, new ones don't automatically appear. The ninth dimension is not about feeling above life. It's about seeing through it. And seeing through something removes its illusion, but not its demands. You still have to live. You still have to choose. You still have to act, but now without the comfort of blind belief. This is why some people describe this level as lonely. Not because you are isolated from others, but because you can no longer fully inhabit shared illusions. You understand why they exist. You understand why people need them, but you can't fully pretend they are solid anymore. There is also a profound humility that comes with this stage. The more you see, the more you realize how little control you actually have. Free will begins to feel contextual. Choice feels constrained by forces larger than the individual mind. This doesn't remove responsibility, it deepens it. Because ignorance is no longer an option, reaching the ninth dimension doesn't make life easier, it makes it clearer, and clarity can be heavy. It strips away excuses. It removes comforting narratives. It forces you to act with awareness rather than impulse. This is why the ninth dimension is not a goal. It's a threshold, a place where consciousness must decide whether it will integrate into life with maturity or detach from life in search of purity. One path leads to grounded wisdom. The other leads to isolation. And that decision is not made once. It's made every day.